Hey guys! Tonight we're going to begin a very long, very meandering, very Roman kind of story. So if you're listening to this in bed, just go ahead and fluff the pillow, dim the lights, maybe pretend you're reclining on one of those ancient couches Romans loved so much. Though hopefully without the smell of goat cheese and sweat that probably came with them. Because this is the Roman Empire we're talking about. The rise, the glory, and the inevitable, slightly embarrassing fall of one of the biggest political soap operas the world has ever staged. And don't worry, I'm not going to shout at you about legions and tactics. This isn't that kind of history lesson. Instead, we'll drift along the centuries, quietly observing emperors who were far too inbred to function, aristocrats with god complexes, and the sort of dynastic drama that makes modern reality TV look like kindergarten circle time. So let's begin, slowly, with Rome when it was, honestly, just kind of a mess. The humble beginning that nobody asked for. Rome didn't burst onto the scene as a shining city of marble. It started out as a swampy, mosquito-infested village by the Tiber River, basically a muddy collection of huts where shepherds argued about goats and probably smelled strongly of smoke and sheep dung. The Romans, being Romans, later invented a whole origin myth about being descended from Trojan heroes, because apparently they thought we started out in a bog with bad drainage wasn't classy enough. According to them, it all began with the twins Romulus and Remus. They were supposedly raised by a wolf, which is less Disney princess charming and more feral child nightmare. Later, Romulus killed his brother, because of course he did, and named the city after himself. Not exactly the family bonding story you'd want on a holiday postcard. Still, the myth was catchy. And the Romans were very good at taking a weird, violent event and turning it into a proud national origin story. So the legend stuck. Kings, but not for long. Before the Republic and way before the Empire, Rome was ruled by kings, which sounds glamorous, but in reality meant a string of monarchs who were either imported from neighboring tribes or were locals pretending to know what they were doing. The seventh and final king, Tarquin the Proud, had a name that tells you everything. He was arrogant, corrupt, and as with many rulers in antiquity, didn't quite know when to quit. His downfall came after one of the most infamous scandals in early Roman lore, the assaults of Lucretia, a noblewoman whose tragic fate sparked outrage and rebellion. Rome, in dramatic fashion, decided never again and kicked the kings out around 509 BCE. They replaced monarchy with the Republic, which was basically a system where rich guys yelled at each other in togas pretending it was democracy. Spoiler, it wasn't. The Republic. All drama, no chill. The Republic ran on checks and balances, which in practice meant constant political fistfights between the elites and the commoners. There were consuls, who were like co-presidents, the Senate, which was a nest of cranky old aristocrats, and assemblies, where the plebeians, basically everyone else, could shout into the void and sometimes get noticed. But here's the thing. Despite the constant bickering, Rome kept expanding. At first, they bullied their neighbors, then they swallowed bigger chunks of Italy. Eventually, they got into long, drawn-out wars with Carthage, which brought elephants, Hannibal, and a lot of overblown hero speeches. By the end of the Punic Wars, Rome had basically chewed through the Mediterranean buffet and realized, hey, we could actually build an empire here. Enter Julius Caesar, the drama king. So, you can't talk about the fall of the Republic without bringing in Julius Caesar. The man was a walking headline machine, ambitious, calculating, and very aware of how good his cheekbones looked on a coin. He came from a patrician family, but spent most of his career climbing the greasy pole of Roman politics. He did the usual stuff: bribery, alliances, backstabbing. Then he went off to Gaul, where he spent years killing a lot of people and writing long, self-promoting commentaries about how great he was. Rome loved him for it, or at least enough of Rome did. The Senate, less so. When he marched back into Italy with his army in 49 BCE, it was basically the ancient version of kicking the door open and yelling, "I'm in charge now." And you probably know how it ended, with him lying on the Senate floor in 44 BCE, stabbed 23 times by people who supposedly loved him, including Brutus, his friend. Though historians still argue about whether they were actually friends, frenemies, or something else entirely. The point is, Caesar's death was supposed to save the Republic. Instead, it killed it. The empire sneaks in. After Caesar came Augustus. Not immediately, of course. There was a long and bloody civil war first, because Rome never did anything the easy way. Augustus, born Octavian, was Caesar's adopted heir. He was young, sickly, and looked like he needed a good nap. But he was clever. He played politics like a harp. He outmaneuvered rivals, crushed Antony and Cleopatra, and by 27 BCE was firmly in control. He called himself Princeps, the first citizen, because dictator for life had bad PR after Caesar. But make no mistake, he was emperor in everything but name. Under Augustus, Rome entered what later got branded as the Pax Romana, the so-called Roman peace, which was only peaceful if you ignored the endless wars at the borders and the occasional purge at home. Still, compared to the chaos before, it was an upgrade. Caligula. Chaos in human form. Now, the Roman Empire was officially off and running, which brings us to the emperors. And oh boy, this is where things get weird, messy, and deeply entertaining. First up, in the please don't let him near sharp objects category, Caligula. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he started out as a promising young ruler, popular with the army, beloved by the people, and then, almost overnight, he spiraled. Some say it was illness, others say paranoia, and maybe it was just his true color showing. Whatever the cause, Caligula became one of the strangest emperors Rome ever produced. He built massive palaces, threw money at pointless projects, and developed a taste for humiliating senators. He supposedly planned to make his horse, Incitatus, a consul, which sounds ridiculous, and probably was an exaggeration, but it stuck, because it perfectly symbolized his disdain for the political class. By the end, even his own guards had enough. In 41 CE, he was assassinated in a palace corridor, which was kind of Rome's way of saying, "You're fired." Let's float over to Claudius. After Caligula's very public meltdown, Rome needed someone calmer. Enter Claudius. He was Caligula's uncle, and the Senate probably thought he'd be easy to control. After all, Claudius had a limp, a stammer, and a reputation for being a little awkward. People assumed he was harmless. Surprise, he wasn't. Claudius turned out to be competent, clever, and surprisingly ruthless when he needed to be. He expanded the empire, built aqueducts, and generally kept things running. But of course, there was family drama. His wives were, let's say, ambitious. Messalina, his third wife, was infamous for her scandalous affairs. She was eventually executed for conspiring against him. Then came Agrippina the Younger, who married him mainly to set up her son Nero for the throne. Which brings us inevitably to Nero. Nero, Rome's teenage nightmare. Nero is one of those emperors whose name instantly makes people think of debauchery, fire, and fiddles. Though, to be fair, the whole fiddling while Rome burned is probably a myth. Violins weren't even invented yet. Still, Nero was not exactly a role model. He started out under the heavy influence of his mother, Agrippina, but eventually had her killed, as one does, apparently, in Roman imperial households. Nero fancied himself an artist, a poet, a singer. He loved performing on stage, which the Roman elite considered horribly undignified. Imagine a head of state forcing his cabinet to watch his community theater-level singing for hours. That was Nero. Then came the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. It destroyed much of the city. And while Nero probably didn't start it, people blamed him anyway. He made things worse by using the... So the main story of Rome has wrapped up, at least in the broad strokes. Rise, expansion, messy emperors, Christianity, collapse. But honestly, some of the most soothing little bedtime morsels come not from the big picture, but from the weird little details. The emperors who reigned for a few months, the forgotten aristocrats with bizarre hobbies, the children who had crowns shoved on their heads before they even knew what numbers were. So let's wander lazily through a few of those stories, one by one. Elagabalus, Rome's teen disaster. Elagabalus, officially known as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, was a Syrian teenager who became emperor in 218 CE at the age of 14, which already sounds like a recipe for chaos. Imagine giving the keys to the world's largest empire to a high school freshman. Elagabalus wasn't just young, he was eccentric on a cosmic scale. He imported the cult of the sun god Elagabal, built himself a lavish temple in Rome, and forced senators to watch him perform bizarre religious ceremonies. His hobbies included throwing wild banquets where he'd serve guests beans and peas made of gold, then dump actual food on the floor. He reportedly released snakes into the crowd during gladiatorial games, which is one way to keep the audience awake. He also went through marriages like sandals, including a scandalous union with the Vestal Virgin, which was basically the Roman equivalent of marrying a nun just to shock everyone. By 222 CE, the Praetorian Guard had had enough. They dragged the teenage emperor out, killed him, and tossed his body in the Tiber. He had reigned for 4 bizarre years, a fever dream of adolescent chaos. Macrinus, the accountant emperor. Before Elagabalus, there was Macrinus. And Macrinus is fascinating mainly because he was boring. He wasn't even from the senatorial elite. He was a career bureaucrat, an equestrian, basically a guy who loved paperwork. He came to power in 217 CE after organizing the assassination of Caracalla, which sounds bold, but the reality is that Macrinus was more interested in balancing budgets than commanding armies. He cut military pay, which was possibly the dumbest move any Roman emperor could make. Soldiers tolerated a lot: debauchery, corruption, even erratic behavior. But cut their paycheck? That was treason. Unsurprisingly, the army revolted. Macrinus tried to run away in disguise, but was captured and executed after barely a year in power. Not exactly the most impressive resume entry. Gordian III, the child emperor. Sometimes Rome seemed addicted to crowning children. Take Gordian III, who became emperor in 338 CE at the tender age of 13. His reign came during the crisis of the 3rd century, which basically means he had no real control. Older men ran the empire in his name, while Gordian tried not to get trampled by the chaos. He was pushed into a Persian war against the formidable King Shapur I, and it didn't go well. Gordian died in mysterious circumstances in 244 CE, either in battle or murdered by his own troops, which feels like the 2 most common exits for Roman emperors anyway. The tragedy here is that Gordian was just a kid. He probably wanted to play dice or go hunting, not deal with insurrections and Parthian cavalry. But Rome was Rome, and children were often just chess pieces in an endless game. Galenius, the underrated one. Not all emperors were disasters. Some were just unlucky. Take Galenius, who ruled from 253 to 268 CE. Galenius gets a bad rap in ancient sources, mostly because senatorial historians hated him. But modern scholars tend to see him as competent, even innovative. He reformed the army, relied on cavalry more than heavy infantry, and tried to shore up defenses during one of Rome's most unstable eras. But the empire was literally crumbling around him. Usurpers popped up everywhere, the Gallic Empire split off in the west, the Palmyrene Empire emerged in the east. Galenius spent his reign racing from one fire to the next, never really catching a break. He was eventually assassinated by his own officers, because of course he was. Still, he probably deserves more credit than he got. Poor Galenius. Even history forgot to send him a thank you card. Vitellius, the year of the four emperors loser. Remember the year of the four emperors? We had Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. Of the four, Vitellius is the one everyone forgets, and maybe for good reason. Vitellius was notorious for his gluttony. Ancient sources loved to paint him as a man whose main hobby was eating, lavish banquets, endless courses, food binges that cost more than most people made in a year. It's hard to tell how much is exaggeration, but let's just say Vitellius wasn't winning any awards for modesty. His reign lasted only 8 months in 69 CE before Vespasian's forces marched into Rome. Vitellius tried to abdicate, but was dragged out, killed, and dumped in the Tiber. Rome really had a thing for tossing emperors in rivers. The forgotten empresses. It's easy to get lost in the parade of emperors, but the imperial women were often just as fascinating, if not more so. Take Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus. She was elegant, calculating, and a political force in her own right. Ancient gossip accused her of poisoning rivals, including Augustus himself. Whether true or not, she certainly shaped the dynasty that followed. Or Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero. She maneuvered herself into power with ruthless skill, even marrying her uncle Claudius to secure her son's throne. Eventually, of course, Nero had her killed, but she left an indelible mark on the imperial stage. Even Helena, Constantine's mother, deserves a mention. She converted to Christianity and, according to legend, traveled to the Holy Land to find relics of the true cross. She turned from tavern maid to saint. A wild career shift if ever there was one. The soldier emperors nobody remembers. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome had over 20 dozen emperors. Most of them were soldier generals lifted to power by the army. Their names blur together: Maximinus Thrax, Philip the Arab, Decius, Valerian. Valerian deserves a special note, though. He was the only Roman emperor ever captured alive by an enemy. In 260 CE, he was taken prisoner by Shapur I of Persia. Shapur reportedly used him as a human footstool when mounting his horse. After Valerian died, his skin was supposedly stuffed and displayed in a Persian temple. If true, it was the ultimate humiliation, and a reminder that Roman emperors were not invincible, no matter how shiny their titles looked. Numerian and the deadly smell. Here's a particularly sleepy footnote. Numerian, a little-known emperor of the late 3rd century, met a very strange end. He was leading his army home from a Persian campaign when he fell ill. His attendants kept him shut inside a litter, basically a covered carriage carried by slaves. For days they claimed he was resting, but the truth came out when soldiers noticed a terrible smell. Yes, Numerian had been dead inside the litter, decomposing in the heat. Nobody had checked on him because, apparently, they thought it was rude to disturb the emperor's nap. Rome's rulers, glorious, godlike, and sometimes literally rotting on the road. And that's the quiet charm of Roman history. No matter how often the names and faces changed, the storyline stayed weirdly consistent. Someone ambitious clawed their way to the top. They enjoyed a brief period of triumph. Then paranoia set in, enemies multiplied, and daggers came out. Finally, they ended up poisoned, stabbed, strangled, or dumped in a river. But yet, despite all of this, the empire lingered on for centuries. The sheer resilience of Rome is almost as strange as the dysfunction of its rulers. So as we drift off here in this bonus detour, remember, not all emperors were Augustuses or Constantines. Many were Elagabaluses, Vitelliuses, Numerians, footnotes in marble, half-forgotten names attached to brief bursts of chaos, which honestly is what makes them the perfect bedtime company. So, last time we left off, Rome was basically auditioning emperors at record speed. Assassination here, military coup there. The crisis of the 3rd century was like watching the world's least fun talent show. Nobody stayed on stage for long, and the prize was usually an early grave. Out of that chaos, though, emerged a man with a plan. Enter Diocletian, the emperor who loved paperwork. Diocletian took power in 284 CE and immediately looked around and thought, okay, this empire is way too big for one guy to handle, which was both honest and sensible, two traits not commonly found in Roman rulers. His solution was the tetrarchy. Instead of one emperor, he split the empire into 4 rulers, 2 senior emperors called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors called Caesars. It was like an imperial group project, and as with all group projects, it went about as well as you'd expect. Still, for a while, it worked. The empire stabilized, borders were defended, and the economy limped along. Diocletian himself was a micromanager. He introduced price controls, reorganized provinces, and launched one of the harshest persecutions of Christians in Roman history. Because apparently, when the empire is falling apart, the solution is to go after people who meet quietly in basements. And then, in a rare move for a Roman emperor, Diocletian actually retired. In 305 CE, he stepped down voluntarily. He built himself a fancy retirement palace on the Dalmatian coast, which, if you've ever been to Split in Croatia, you can still wander through today. Basically, he invented the concept of beachfront retirement communities. Constantine, Christianity, and Constantinople. But of course, the tetrarchy didn't last. Almost immediately, the emperors started fighting each other again. Shocking, I know. Out of the mess rose Constantine the Great. He's famous for 2 things: converting to Christianity and founding Constantinople, which both were massive game changers. Constantine came to power after a series of civil wars, most famously the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE. According to legend, he saw a vision of the Christian cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He slapped the symbol on his soldier shields, won the battle, and decided Christianity was worth betting on. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE legalized Christianity, and Constantine himself became the first Christian emperor. Well, sort of. His actual beliefs were complicated, and he wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed, which is a very Roman way of hedging your bets. And then there was Constantinople. In 330 CE, Constantine founded his shiny new capital on the site of Byzantium. It was rich, strategically placed, and far away from the cranky Senate in Rome. The city would outlast the Western Empire by 1,000 years, which honestly makes Constantine look like he knew what he was doing. After Constantine, too many sons, too few brains. When Constantine died, he did what so many emperors had done before. He left the empire to his sons. And surprise, they immediately started fighting each other. The empire was carved up among Constantine I, Constantine II, and Constans. None of them were particularly inspiring. Constantine I died in battle against his brother, Constans got overthrown, Constantius II eventually ruled alone but spent most of his time quarreling with bishops over theology, because nothing says urgent imperial business like arguing whether Jesus was made of the same substance as God or just a very similar substance. And by the mid-4th century, the empire was still big, still powerful, but starting to look tired. The borders were under constant pressure from Persians, Goths, and assorted tribes who had the audacity to not want Roman rule. Julian the Apostate, the last guy who tried to drag Rome back to paganism. Julian was Constantine's nephew, and he'd watched the Christianization of the empire with skepticism. When he became emperor in 361 CE, he rolled back Christian privileges, reopened pagan temples, and basically said, let's rewind the clock a bit. He was clever, energetic, and surprisingly competent. But his reign was short. In 363 CE, he died during a Persian campaign, leaving no heirs. His attempt at restoring pagan Rome fizzled out, and Christianity kept marching forward. Theodosius I, the Christian Empire. After Julian, Rome had a string of emperors who mostly tried to keep the wheels from falling off. The big turning point came under Theodosius I, who ruled from 379 to 395. Theodosius made Christianity the official state religion of the empire. Pagan rituals were banned, temples were shut down, and the old gods were officially retired. Imagine a civilization that had worshipped Jupiter and Mars for over 1,000 years suddenly being told, nope, it's all Christianity now. That was Theodosius. And with his death in 395 CE, the empire was permanently split between his two sons, Arcadus in the east and Honorius in the west. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, would carry on as the Byzantine Empire. The Western Empire, well, let's just say its best days were behind it. Honorius. Chickens before empires. Honorius, ruling in the West, was not exactly an inspiring figure. In fact, he's remembered mostly for being deeply unimpressive. When the city of Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths in 1010 CE, the first time the Eternal City had fallen in 800 years, Honorius was reportedly more upset about the death of his pet chicken, also named Rome, which, if true, is both darkly hilarious and deeply on brand for late imperial leadership. The sack of Rome by Alaric and his Visigoths shocked the ancient world, but the empire itself staggered on, wounded but not quite dead. Valentinian III and the Huns. Fast forward a bit, and we get to Valentinian III, who reigned for a good chunk of the 5th century but achieved very little. His era was defined by the looming threat of Attila the Hun. Attila terrorized both East and West, raiding, extorting, and generally being everyone's nightmare. In 451 CE, a massive battle at the Catalonian plains in Gaul managed to halt his advance, but Rome couldn't really claim much credit. By this point, it was relying heavily on barbarian allies to fight other barbarians. Valentinian himself eventually assassinated his top general, Aetius, the one man actually keeping the empire afloat. A court official supposedly told him, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." Valentinian was then assassinated himself not long after. Poetic in a very Roman way. Romulus Augustulus, the end of the road. By the mid-4th century, the Western Empire was essentially a hollow shell. Emperors came and went, often propped up by barbarian generals who were the real power behind the throne. The final act came in 476 CE. A teenage emperor named Romulus Augustulus was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain who decided he'd had enough of the charade. Romulus was spared, sent into retirement rather than killed, probably because even Odoacer realized the poor kid wasn't worth the effort. And with that, the Western Roman Empire officially ended. No dramatic last stand, no fiery apocalypse, just a whimper, a paper shuffle, and a teenager losing his job. Meanwhile, in the East. It's worth remembering, though, that the Eastern Roman Empire carried on just fine. In fact, the Byzantines thought of themselves as Romans right up until 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans. So, in a way, the Roman Empire didn't die in 476. It just relocated, changed its wardrobe, and learned to speak Greek more than Latin. But for our purposes tonight, the Western Empire, the one of Caesars, Colosseums, and crumbling aqueducts, had reached its quiet conclusion. And that, my friends, is the end of Rome's long bedtime story. From swampy huts by the Tiber to marble palaces, from Romulus, the wolf-raised twin, to Romulus Augustulus, the forgotten boy emperor. Centuries of power, drama, and incompetence slowly fading into history. So if you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived Rome's rise and fall. And if you're already asleep, well, that's probably the best possible tribute to the empire that just couldn't stop drifting toward collapse.
The world's greatest artist, while, arranging his own death. Classic Rome. But the thing is, when an emperor like Nero goes down, Rome doesn't just shrug and carry on, it spirals. The year 69 CE became known as the Year of the Four Emperors, which is exactly what it sounds like. 4 different guys claimed the throne in quick succession, and Rome basically played a violent game of musical chairs with the imperial seat. The winner? A rather no-nonsense man named Vespasian. Vespasian, dad energy in a toga. Vespasian was the founder of the Flavian dynasty, and compared to Nero's artsy chaos, he was refreshingly practical. He had military credentials, he knew how to manage finances, and he had that classic dad humor streak. Like when he introduced a tax on public urinals, and when people complained, he supposedly held up a coin and said, "Money doesn't smell," which honestly is exactly the kind of thing your uncle would say while buying a used car. Under Vespasian, Rome stabilized. He launched the construction of the Colosseum, which, fun fact, was built partly with money looted from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Nothing says public entertainment venue like financing it with sacred treasure from a conquered people. Still, Vespasian got things done. He reigned in corruption, balanced the budget, and proved that Rome could survive even after a drama bomb like Nero. Titus, Mr. Popular. After Vespasian came his son Titus, and for once the imperial succession didn't immediately implode. Titus had already made himself a name for himself as the general who captured Jerusalem in 70 CE, which was a major event for Rome, and a catastrophic one for Jewish history. The destruction of the Second Temple was, let's just say, not a great PR moment. But when he became emperor, Titus worked hard to be beloved, and it sort of worked. He helped rebuild Rome after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. Yes, the one that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and pumice. He also responded to a major fire in Rome itself the following year. People liked him, which is rare for Roman emperors. Naturally, he died young. In 81 CE, at just 41 years old, Titus suddenly keeled over, leaving everyone suspicious. Was it natural causes? Poisoning? Nobody knows for sure, but the timing was very convenient for his brother. Domitian, the paranoid younger brother.
Domitian, younger son of Vespasian, took the throne next, and let's just say he was not the cuddly family man his father had been. Domitian liked power. He liked it a lot. He micromanaged everything from the army to the economy to religious practices. He demanded to be addressed as Lord and God, which is basically the ancient Roman version of asking everyone at the office to call you Supreme Boss Man. He wasn't entirely incompetent. He strengthened the empire's borders and kept finances in decent shape. But his paranoia was legendary. He executed senators left and right, staged show trials, and generally made the elite hate him. Eventually, in 96 CE, a palace conspiracy did him in. His own servant stabbed him in his bedroom, which honestly had become a very Roman way to clock out of the job by that point. Nerva, Trajan, and adopted stability. After Domitian's rather bloody exit, Rome entered a new phase, the so-called 5 good emperors, which is a bit generous, but compared to the last batch, they really did look pretty good. It began with Nerva. He was old, childless, and chosen mainly as a safe stopgap emperor. The real genius of Nerva was adopting a competent successor instead of leaving things to biological chance. And that successor was Trajan. Trajan was the empire builder par excellence. Under him, Rome reached its maximum territorial size, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. He built monuments, aqueducts, forums, and a giant column that basically brags about how many Dacians he killed. Subtlety was not Rome's strong suit. The Senate adored him, the army respected him, and the people loved him, which meant he was basically the unicorn of Roman emperors. Naturally, he was succeeded by another solid pick, Hadrian. Hadrian was Trajan's adopted son and heir. He had a very different vibe. Less conqueror, more consolidator. He famously pulled back from some of Trajan's overextended territories and focused on strengthening Rome's borders. His most famous project? Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. Yes, that big stone wall across the English countryside that basically said, "We've had enough of the angry Scots, thanks." Hadrian also fancied himself a bit of a philosopher king. He traveled constantly, inspecting provinces, promoting Greek culture, and dabbling in architecture. His personal life was marked by his deep relationship with Antonius, a young Greek companion who tragically drowned in the Nile. Hadrian, devastated, had him deified and founded an entire cult around him, which was a little extra, but very on brand for emperors with too much power and too few emotional outlets. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic dad of the empire. Skipping forward a little bit, we land on Marcus Aurelius, one of Rome's most famous emperors. He's remembered today as the philosopher king, the Stoic who scribbled down meditations on duty, mortality, and self-control while running an empire. It sounds noble, but his reign was far from peaceful. Plagues swept through the empire, wars raged on the frontiers, and Marcus spent much of his rule shivering in military camps rather than reclining in marble halls. His personal writings, the Meditations, are filled with reminders to himself to stay calm, accept hardship, and not let anger control him, which, considering the chaos around him, was probably the only thing keeping him sane. But Marcus made one unstoic mistake. He broke the tradition of adopting a competent heir. Instead, he handed the throne to his biological son, and that son was Commodus, the gladiator emperor. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, you probably know a dramatized version of Commodus. The truth is, not much better. Commodus was spoiled, arrogant, and more interested in play acting than ruling. He fancied himself a reincarnation of Hercules, liked to strut around in lion skins, and spent a suspicious amount of time fighting in the Colosseum. Except these weren't real fights. His opponents were often unarmed or handicapped because heaven forbid the emperor actually break a sweat. The Senate despised him, the people mocked him, and his reign became a carnival of ego. At one point, he renamed Rome after himself, which is the political equivalent of changing your Wi-Fi password to Best Emperor 1234. By 92 CE, his behavior had become intolerable. A conspiracy of palace officials and his mistress arranged his assassination. He was strangled in his bath, which, to be fair, is a very undignified way for an emperor to go, but also very fitting. Septimus Severus, back to military mode. After Commodus, Rome descended into yet another civil war, because at this point, why not? Out of the chaos emerged Septimus Severus, a North African general who clawed his way to power. He was tough, pragmatic, and all about the army. He openly said to his sons, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others," which is basically a manual for military dictatorship. He expanded Rome's borders, boosted the soldiers' pay, and left behind a dynasty. But of course, leaving power to biological heirs never went well in Rome. His son, Caracalla, would soon prove that point in spectacular fashion. Caracalla, whose real name was Marcus Aurelius Antonius, because Romans loved recycling names, is remembered for two things: granting Roman citizenship to basically everyone in the empire and murdering a lot of people. The citizenship decree sounds generous, but it was mostly about expanding the tax base, because Rome always needed more money. Caracalla also had a temper. He killed his own brother Geta during what was supposed to be a peace meeting, then ordered a damnatio memoriae, erasing Geta's name from inscriptions and statues. Very sibling rivalry, very extra. In the end, Caracalla was assassinated while relieving himself by the roadside in 217 CE, which, to be fair, is a very undignified way for an emperor to go, but also very fitting. Let's drift toward crisis. After Caracalla, things really started unraveling. Emperors came and went in rapid succession.
Rome loved dynasties almost as much as it loved aqueducts. There was something comforting about the idea of the throne passing neatly from one relative to another, as if political chaos could be cured with family dinners. Spoiler, it could not. Instead, dynasties gave us centuries of jealous cousins, scheming mothers, betrayed sons, and very awkward banquets. So let's float slowly through the messiest imperial families Rome ever produced. The Julio-Claudians. Dysfunction, but make it classic. We start with the OG dysfunctional family, the Julio-Claudians. From Augustus to Nero, this clan managed to produce 5 emperors in just under a century, and about 5 million family scandals. Augustus kicked things off by marrying and remarrying until he had an heir. He eventually settled on adopting Tiberius, his reluctant stepson. Tiberius, in turn, hated Rome so much that he retired to Capri, leaving the empire in the hands of sycophants and letting rumors swirl that he was enjoying questionable pool parties with boys. Enter Caligula, Tiberius's grandnephew, who treated Rome like his personal playground. He declared himself a living god, tried to appoint his horse consul, and generally made everyone nervous. Then came Claudius, who was dismissed as a stuttering, limping fool, but somehow managed to survive palace intrigue long enough to rule effectively. He also married his niece Agrippina, because why not? And finally, Nero, the boy who started out as an artist and ended up setting Rome on fire, literally and figuratively. He murdered his mother, his wife, probably Britannicus, and most of his dignity before dramatically fleeing the city with a tragic cry of, "What an artist dies in me." The Julio-Claudians were the first imperial dynasty. They were also a reminder that family ties in Rome were less about love and more about daggers under the dinner table. The Severins, Family Feud, North African Edition. Next, the Severan dynasty, founded by Septimius Severus, who clawed his way to power in 193 CE. This family turned imperial politics into a messy group project where everyone hated each other. Septimius ruled well enough, but his dying advice to his sons Caracalla and Geta was basically, be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and don't care about anyone else. Which sounds lovely, except his sons despised each other. Caracalla and Geta were supposed to co-rule. Instead, they split the palace in half like squabbling roommates. One side for Caracalla, one side for Geta, with guards patrolling the hallways to keep them from stabbing each other during bathroom breaks. Eventually, Caracalla lured Geta to a meeting with their mother present. Once Geta walked in, soldiers killed him in their mom's arms. Caracalla then banned mourning, so the empire had to pretend like this was totally normal. Afterward, Caracalla ruled alone, raised taxes, launched disastrous campaigns, and was eventually stabbed to death by one of his own guards while relieving himself on the side of the road. Dignity was not his strong suit. The Severan line limped on through a few more relatives, like Elagabalus, the teenage high priest who thought it would be fun to replace Jupiter with his favorite Syrian sun god. Romans were not amused. Elagabalus also married multiple times, including a Vestal virgin, and allegedly decorated banquet halls with more unusual entertainments. Eventually, his grandmother ordered him strangled. So yes, the Severans were a dynasty where brothers murdered brothers, teenagers tried to rewrite the state religion, and grandmothers stepped in to have their own grandchildren assassinated. Family dinners must have been a delight. The Constantinians, holy chaos. Finally, the Constantinian dynasty, proof that even when Christianity came into the mix, family dysfunction was alive and well. It begins, of course, with Constantine the Great, the man who legalized Christianity and founded Constantinople. Great PR, solid resume. But Constantine's family life, oh dear. He had his wife Fausta executed by suffocation in an overheated bath. Why? Possibly because she was accused of having an affair with his son Crispus, or possibly because Constantine just wanted to get rid of her. The sources can't agree. Crispus himself, Constantine's brilliant son, was executed on charges of treason or adultery, depending on which rumor you prefer. So yes, father-son bonding was not their thing. After Constantine's death, things only got messier. His 3 surviving sons divided the empire between them, and within a year or so, they were killing off cousins to secure their positions, because nothing says family loyalty like a bloodbath at the family reunion. Constantius II, one of Constantine's sons, became notorious for paranoia. He saw plots everywhere, often from his own relatives, and preemptively executed them. The dynasty finally produced Julian the Apostate, Constantine's nephew, who tried to reverse the Christianization of the empire and bring back the old gods. It didn't work. He died young, stabbed in battle under mysterious circumstances, and Christianity kept marching forward. The Constantinians proved that even when emperors switched gods, they didn't switch habits. Murder, paranoia, and awkward banquets were still the backbone of imperial family life. The big picture. Dynasty equals disaster. Looking across the Julio-Claudians, Severans, and Constantinians, a pattern emerges. Whenever Rome leaned too hard into dynasties, things went sideways. Ambitious mothers poisoned rivals, brothers killed brothers, sons turned on fathers,
and sometimes entire branches of the family tree were pruned in one bloody afternoon. If you wanted a long life in ancient Rome, the best career choice was probably obscure farmer in the provinces. If you wanted a short and stressful life, being born into the imperial family was your golden ticket. A sleepy takeaway. So next time someone says dynasties create stability, just remember Rome's track record. The purple cloak wasn't just heavy, it was cursed by the weight of family feuds, betrayals, and enough awkward holiday dinners to fuel centuries of gossip. And yet, somehow, the empire rolled on. Not because the families were functional, but because Rome was too big to fail, at least for a while.
Now, if adult emperors were already disasters in togas, imagine what happened when Rome handed the crown to actual children. It happened more often than you think, because Romans loved dynasties, they loved bloodlines, and they loved the idea of keeping the throne in the family, even if the heir in question was still playing with toy soldiers instead of commanding real ones. So tonight, let's drift through some of Rome's saddest, strangest imperial kids, the toddlers, tweens, and teenagers who found themselves at the helm of the empire. Spoiler, it rarely went well. Nero as a boy, groomed for disaster. Before he was the fiddle-playing, lyre-playing emperor of legend, Nero was a rather pampered, nervous boy. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 CE, his father died when he was young. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, remarried Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, and maneuvered her son into position as heir. Nero spent his youth surrounded by tutors. Some of them were serious intellectuals, like the philosopher Seneca, who probably hoped to mold him into a thoughtful Stoic. Others were sycophants, who told him exactly what he wanted to hear. The result was a teenager who liked poetry, racing, and performance far more than politics or governance. When he ascended the throne at 16, he was ill-prepared. It didn't help that his mother kept trying to control him. Eventually, Nero solved that problem the way many Roman emperors solved family squabbles. He had her killed. So if you've ever wondered how a young man ended up burning through Rome's goodwill and his own sanity, the answer is that he was groomed from boyhood to be spoiled, artistic, and just unstable enough to crumble under pressure. Gaius Caligula, the tiny mascot. Before Caligula was Caligula, he was just Gaius, the adorable toddler in the camp of his father, Germanicus. Soldiers gave him the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, because he wore tiny child-sized military sandals. It was cute when he was 3, less cute when he was emperor, and the nickname stuck forever. Imagine being the ruler of the known world and everyone still calling you Bootsy. Raised in a whirlpool of dynastic intrigue, Gaius spent much of his youth surrounded by plots, poisonings, and backstabbing relatives. By the time he became emperor at 24, his childhood nickname was the least of his problems. He unraveled quickly, perhaps always destined to given his early traumas. But it's a reminder that even Rome's most infamous emperors once started as fragile, overexposed children in a poisonous political aquarium. Gordian III, the 13-year-old emperor. Ah yes, Gordian III, crowned in 238 CE at the tender age of 13. To put that in perspective, while most kids his age were worrying about pimples and homework, Gordian was handed the Roman purple and told to keep the empire together during one of its most chaotic centuries. Of course, adults ran the show for him. The Senate propped him up, generals fought in his name, and he was paraded around as the child savior of Rome. But being a teenage emperor was hardly a fun gig.
He was dragged into wars with Persia, where he reportedly died in murky circumstances. Was it battle? Was it an assassination? Nobody's sure. Either way, Rome lost another boy emperor, chewed up and spit out by forces far larger than himself. Valentinian II. Too young, too overwhelmed. Valentinian II was proclaimed emperor in 375 CE, at the age of 4. 4! He couldn't even tie his own sandals, but he was technically ruler of half the Roman world. In reality, he was a puppet for military leaders and his formidable mother, Justina. He spent his teenage years caught between powerful generals, bishops, and his own lack of authority. His reign was overshadowed by civil wars, religious disputes, and political manipulations. By 392 CE, at just 21, he was found dead in his palace, allegedly by suicide, though many suspected foul play. A boy who had the empire thrust upon him at 4 years old ended his short life crushed by responsibilities he never asked for. Romulus Augustulus, the last kid emperor. And of course, we can't forget Romulus Augustulus, the teenage emperor whose deposition in 476 CE marked the official end of the Western Roman Empire. Romulus wasn't really destined for greatness. His father Orestes made him emperor as a political puppet. He was around 14 when he got the crown, a boy emperor ruling a crumbling state with no real power. When the Germanic general Odoacer deposed him, Romulus wasn't killed. He was sent into comfortable retirements with a pension, which honestly might make him one of the luckiest child emperors. Imagine deposed at 16, and then you just live out your days quietly, spared the knives, poisons, and conspiracies. In a way, Romulus Augustulus had the happiest ending of any Roman emperor. He got to survive. The boy who never was, Britannicus. Sometimes the saddest stories are about heirs who never made it to the throne. Take Britannicus, the biological son of Emperor Claudius. He was the rightful heir, until Agrippina maneuvered her son Nero into position instead. Britannicus was about 13 when Claudius died, possibly poisoned by Agrippina. As Nero took power, Britannicus became a dangerous rival. So, during a banquet in 55 CE, he was suddenly struck down, poisoned, according to nearly every source. The boy collapsed in front of the court. Nero, then 17, calmly explained that it was just an epileptic fit. Everyone nodded politely, knowing full well what had happened. Britannicus never wore the purple. His story ended before it even began. The pattern. Too small for the purple. What all these imperial children share is the sheer weight of expectation. Rome loved the idea of dynasties, heirs, and bloodlines, but in practice, putting crowns on kids meant turning them into pawns in other people's power games. Some, like Nero or Caligula, grew up twisted by it. Others, like Gordian III or Valentinian II, were broken by it. And some, like Romulus Augustulus, were just swept away in the tide of history. For every Augustus or Constantine, there were half a dozen unlucky children forced into roles they were never ready for. And let's be honest, Rome's obsession with dynastic succession was really just one long, messy experiment in proving that heredity doesn't make for good leadership. The empire lasted for centuries, not because of the brilliance of its child rulers, but despite them. Propped up by generals, senators, administrators, and sheer inertia, Rome staggered forward until even inertia couldn't save it anymore. So, as we wrap up this detour, picture it. Little boys in purple cloaks, too young to shave, being paraded through the forum while old generals muttered behind them, waiting for their chance to seize power. It's tragic, a little absurd, and very Roman. And if that isn't the perfect bedtime thought, the empire ruled by children who never stood a chance, I don't know what is.